Now look, I've been watching State of the Union addresses for a long time. I've delivered 4 of them myself, and I've sat in that chamber more times than I can count. And I want to tell you something. What happened last night on February 24th, 2026, in that House chamber, it wasn't just a speech. Something shifted. And I don't think enough people are talking about what it actually means. See, most folks woke up this morning, they saw the headlines. Longest State of the Union ever, 108 minutes. Hockey players got medals, Democrats got yelled at, and they moved on with their day. I understand that. People are busy. They're worried about groceries and rent and whether their kids are going to be okay. I get it. But here's the honest truth. The most important things that happened in that speech last night weren't the parts that made the news. They weren't the standing ovations or the shouting matches. They were the quieter moments, the ones that slipped right past most people. A president standing in front of Supreme Court justices he publicly humiliated just 4 days earlier and calling their ruling unfortunate. A claim with zero evidence that the other party can only get elected by cheating. A case being built piece by piece for what could become another military conflict in the Middle East. And we'll come back to all of that in a moment. What I want you to understand right now is this. The State of the Union is not supposed to be entertainment. It is supposed to be a president's honest accounting to the people who sent him there. And when that accounting stops being honest, when it becomes a performance designed to divide rather than inform, then something fundamental in our democracy starts to break down. Not with a bang, quietly, gradually, in ways that most people don't notice until it's too late. And that's what I'm worried about today. Not about one speech, about what comes after it. Now, before we get into what he said and what he didn't say, you have to understand the moment this speech was delivered into, because context is everything. It always is. Let me tell you something. When I gave my State of the Union in January 1998, I was in the middle of the hardest stretch of my presidency. Everybody knows that. But I walked into that chamber and I talked about policy. I talked about balancing the budget. I talked about what we were going to do for working families, because that's what the American people deserved: substance, not spectacle. Now look at where President Trump stood last night. His approval ratings are scraping historic lows. Only 39% of Americans approve of his handling of the economy, and that's the issue people care about most. A partial government shutdown is ongoing right now because Democrats in Congress refused to fund the Department of Homeland Security after federal agents killed 2 American citizens in Minneapolis back in January, Renee Good and Alex Pretty. Those are real names, real people. And the president didn't mention them once. 4 days before this speech, the Supreme Court struck down his signature global tariffs in a 6-3 ruling. His own appointees voted against him. He called it an embarrassment to their families. Meanwhile, 2 aircraft carrier groups are deployed toward Iran. Tensions are rising, and the 2026 midterm elections are less than 9 months away, with Republicans facing serious headwinds. We've got to remember that's the landscape. That's what a president is supposed to address when he walks into that chamber. The real State of the Union, the difficult truths, not just the comfortable ones. And this is where things start to get complicated. Because instead of meeting this moment with honesty and accountability, what we got was 108 minutes of a president who chose to double down on everything that put him in this position in the first place. And the consequences of that choice, well, those are going to unfold whether we're paying attention or not. All right, let's get into it. Let's talk about what was actually said in that chamber. And just as importantly, what wasn't. President Trump stood up there and declared, we're living in a golden age. He said the roaring economy is roaring like never before. Now look, I love optimism. I built my whole presidency on it. But optimism has to be rooted in something real. And when 65% of Americans disapprove of your handling of inflation, you can't just tell them the good times are here and expect them to believe it. He claimed he inherited inflation at record levels. That's just not true. When he took office in January 2025, annualized inflation was at 3%, well off any record. He said tariffs are paid by foreign countries. Every serious economic study says that's wrong. American consumers and businesses bear those costs. And then he floated this idea that tariffs could someday replace the federal income tax. Let me tell you something. That is not a serious policy proposal. That's a fantasy. Now, here's what really got me. He talked about immigration for a long stretch. Graphic stories, emotional appeals, the whole playbook. But he never once mentioned Renee Good or Alex Preddy. He never mentioned the Minneapolis crisis that caused the DHS shutdown. He left that part of the story completely out. When a president edits out the facts that explain why the other side is fighting back, the whole conversation becomes dishonest. And for a speech that ran 108 minutes, the longest in modern history, there was almost no legislative agenda. A handful of asks, no major infrastructure plan, no real affordability proposal, nothing for the families sitting at their kitchen tables wondering how they're going to make it through the month. I've always believed you can disagree on policy, but you cannot disagree on facts. And last night, there was a whole lot of disagreement with the facts. Now, I want to be clear about something. Every State of the Union address is a series of choices. What you talk about, what you leave out, who you honor, who you challenge, every single piece of it is deliberate. And the choices President Trump made last night tell you everything you need to know about how he sees this moment. Let me tell you something. The number one issue for American families right now is affordability. Groceries, rent, health care. People are struggling. And the president had the biggest platform in the world to look them in the eye and say, I hear you, and here's what we're going to do. He didn't. He chose to talk about a golden age that most Americans don't feel they're living in. That's not just a strategic mistake. That's a failure of empathy. Then there was the moment he dared Democrats to stand up, framing it so that if you didn't rise to your feet, you were somehow against protecting American citizens. Now look, I've worked across the aisle my entire career. I know what real bipartisan leadership looks like. and it doesn't look like setting traps for the other party on national television. That's not governance. That's gamesmanship. And calling Democrats crazy, saying they are destroying this country from that podium in that chamber with the whole nation watching. When I was president, I learned that the words you speak in that room carry weight far beyond one evening. They shape how Americans see each other the next morning. Then you had the showmanship, the hockey team, the medals, a Presidential Medal of Freedom for a goaltender during a State of the Union. Now, I'm all for honoring achievement, but when you use the solemn power of presidential recognition as stagecraft, you diminish both the honor and the office. Every one of these was a choice, and together they paint a picture of a president who came to perform, not to lead. Now let me get into the parts that I've been building toward. And I want you to stay with me here because this is where it starts to get dangerous. Not dangerous in the way cable news means it, with the flashing graphics and the scary music. Dangerous in the way that a slow leak in a foundation is dangerous. You don't see it until the floor starts to give way. Let's start with the Supreme Court. 4 days before this speech, 6 justices, including some he appointed, struck down his global tariffs, a 6-3 ruling. That's not a close call. That's the court saying clearly that a president overstepped his constitutional authority. Now, any president has a right to disagree with a court ruling. I disagreed with rulings during my time. But there's a difference between disagreeing and degrading. When President Trump called that decision an embarrassment to their families, and then stood in that chamber, feet away from sitting justices, and said congressional action will not be necessary to reimpose those tariffs, he wasn't just expressing frustration. He was telling the American people that neither the court nor the Congress has the authority to check him. And that, my friends, is not how our system works. The separation of powers isn't a suggestion. It's the architecture of the republic. When a president signals that he will simply find alternative legal justifications to get around a Supreme Court ruling, he's not solving a policy problem. He's eroding the very structure that protects every American's rights. Now let's talk about elections. And this, to me, was the most dangerous part of the entire evening. President Trump stood in that chamber and said that Democrats can only get elected by cheating. He said cheating is rampant. He demanded passage of the Save America Act, and he offered not one shred of evidence for any of it. We've got to remember, every major audit, every court challenge, every investigation into the 2020 and 2024 elections found no widespread fraud, none. And yet here is a sitting president using the most watched address of the year to tell Americans they can't trust their own elections. With the Department of Justice reportedly seizing ballots from Fulton County and talk of nationalizing election oversight, we are watching something very serious take shape. When a president tries to convince citizens that democracy itself is broken, while simultaneously moving to control the machinery of elections, That's not protecting election integrity. That's threatening it. And I don't say that lightly. And then there's the DHS shutdown. The president attacked Democrats for refusing to fund the Department of Homeland Security, but he never told the audience why. He never mentioned that 2 American citizens were killed by federal agents in Minneapolis. He erased the part of the story that explains the other side's position. And that's how institutional trust dies. Not through debate, but through deliberate omission. When a president can stand in that chamber and leave out the facts that make his critics' case understandable, the whole national conversation becomes dishonest. The American people deserve to hear the full story every time, even when it's uncomfortable. Now, let me step back for a moment, because I think it's important to look at what's really being set up here. Not just what was said last night, but what it's designed to accomplish in the months ahead. Because if you've been in politics as long as I have, you learn to listen not just to the words, but to the strategy underneath them. Let me tell you something. I see 3 things being built, and they all point toward the 2026 midterms and beyond. The first is immigration as a loyalty test. The way that speech was structured, every Democrat who didn't stand was going to be clipped and put into a campaign ad. That was by design. The goal isn't to pass immigration reform. It's to create a binary. You're either with the president or you're against protecting Americans. That's not how serious immigration policy works. I passed real immigration enforcement measures in the 1990s. It required negotiation, compromise, and a recognition that the other side had legitimate concerns. What we saw last night was the opposite of that. The second thing is the preemptive undermining of the midterm elections. By pushing the Save America Act and the fraud narrative now, 9 months before Election Day, Trump is building a framework. If Republicans hold Congress, the system worked. If they lose, it was stolen. We've seen this before. And I want to be very direct. When a president lays the groundwork to challenge election results before a single vote is cast, that is a threat to democratic self-governance, period. The third piece is Iran. 2 carrier groups in the region. A president who declared he will never allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. Language that's moving from diplomacy toward ultimatum. Now, I dealt with Iran during my presidency. I understand the complexity. But when a president starts building the rhetorical case for military action during a State of the Union address, the country needs to pay very close attention, because that drumbeat has a way of getting louder. And once it starts, it's very hard to stop. A foreign conflict before the midterms could reshape the entire political landscape, and every seasoned observer knows it. I was glad to see Governor Spanberger's Democratic response focus squarely on the economy and affordability. That was the right call, because the strongest answer to spectacle is always substance. Here's what I think is coming, and I want to be honest with you, I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody does. But I've spent a lifetime in this business, and certain patterns are hard to miss. On the midterms, President Trump's refusal to address affordability in any real way is going to cost Republicans. People vote their pocketbooks. They always have. If Democrats stay disciplined If they keep talking about grocery prices, about rent, about health care costs, about the things that actually keep families up at night, they have a very strong shot at flipping the House. But here's the warning. The Save America Act, new voter restrictions, and the politicization of election oversight could create real obstacles. Democrats can't just run a good campaign. They have to fight like hell to make sure the playing field is fair. That's not partisan, that's foundational. On Iran, I'm genuinely concerned. The combination of murky diplomatic language, a massive military presence in the Gulf, and a president who has shown he's willing to take dramatic action to shift political narratives, that creates a genuine risk of escalation, possibly before November. I've been in a situation room. I know what it feels like when the options start narrowing. And I worry that this administration may be walking down a path where the options narrow very quickly. On the Supreme Court, Trump's promise to find alternative legal justifications for tariffs means this is going back to court. There will be another constitutional confrontation. And the question is whether the judiciary can hold its ground when a president is publicly attacking its legitimacy. I believe it can, but it will be tested in ways we haven't seen since Watergate. On election integrity, and this is what keeps me up at night. If a sitting president uses the machinery of the Department of Justice and new federal voting laws to influence a midterm election, we are in territory that no modern American president has taken us. That's not hyperbole. That's a factual description of what's being assembled. And on the Democratic Party's future, I saw the NPR analysis about a 2028 reckoning for Democrats on direction and identity, and they're right. Opposition isn't enough. The party has to offer an affirmative economic vision, a real plan for working families, for the middle class, for people who feel like the system has left them behind. That's how I won in 1992, and the principle hasn't changed. Let me close with this. The State of the Union address is one of the few moments in American life where the entire country is supposed to come together and hear honestly where we stand. It's not a rally, it's not a performance, it's an act of democratic accountability. A president standing before the people's representatives and telling the truth, even when it's hard. What we saw last night fell short of that standard. Not because I disagree with every policy. There are areas where any honest person can find common ground, but because the speech chose performance over substance, division over unity, and confrontation over the kind of honest reckoning that the country desperately needs right now. Now, I've lived long enough to know that America has survived difficult moments before. We survived Watergate. We survived the financial crisis. We've survived deep, painful partisan divisions that felt like they might tear us apart. And every time, what saved us wasn't one leader or one party. It was the resilience of our institutions and the determination of ordinary citizens who refused to give up on the idea that this country belongs to all of us. But I want to be honest with you. The combination of what I see right now worries me in a way that's different from past challenges. Executive overreach, institutional erosion, efforts to undermine public trust in elections, and the possibility of a military conflict that could change everything. That's a lot of pressure on a system at once, and systems hold until they don't. So here's what I'll leave you with. The question isn't whether you agree with me or with him. The question is whether you believe that the American system, the courts, the Congress, free and fair elections, still matters more than any one president. Because if you do, then you have work to do. Vote, pay attention, hold your leaders accountable, all of them, including the ones you like. Talk to your neighbors, even the ones you disagree with. And remember that democracy is not a spectator sport. It never has been. I've had the honor of standing in that chamber. I know what it means. I know the weight of it. And I believe with everything I've got that the American people are smarter than any speech, no matter how long it is. The country is still ours to save, but only if we decide it's worth saving. And I think it is. I know it is.